Truly leveraging and benefiting from streaming data is hard. The data stack is costly, difficult to use, and still has limitations. Materialize breaks down those barriers with a true cloud-native streaming database, not simply a database that connects to streaming systems. With a Postgres-compatible interface, you can now work with real-time data using ANSI SQL, including the ability to perform multi-way complex joins, which support stream-to-stream, stream-to-table, table-to-table, and more, all in standard SQL. Go to dataengineeringpodcast.com/materialize today and sign up for early access to get started. If you like what you see and want to help make it better, they're hiring. Your host is Tobias Macey, and today I'm interviewing Chris Merrick about the Omni Analytics platform and how they are adding automatic data modeling to your business intelligence. So, Chris, can you start by introducing yourself?
Sure, and thanks for having me. I'm the CTO of Omni and co-founder, and I've been working in the data management and analytics space for over 10 years now at various sort of types of products like BI tools, and most recently at a company called Stitch that does data integration.
And do you remember how you first got started working in data?
Yeah, so I kind of stumbled into it. I friends of friends who were starting a BI company called RJ Metrics, and this was back in like 2009 or 2010. And I was kind of on the hunt for a new job for no particular reason, and decided to check out what they were doing. I was really sort of intrigued by like the breadth of the problem and the creative, sort of the open space to solve problems creatively. And was really excited about joining a startup because at the time RJ Metrics was just the two co-founders. So I came on as the first engineer on the team. And so I spent about 6 or 7 years working on the RJ Metrics BI product, and serving in various sort of engineering and product roles, and became actually sort of gravitated as a company. We sort of gravitated towards the data integration side of the problem, and so what ended up happening was we sort of we tried to sort of tackle the entire problem from soup to nuts, beginning with actually doing the data integration, hosting the data warehouse, and the BI tool on top of it. And I think in many ways we're trying to do too many things. But what ended up happening was that the place we got the most resonance in the market was actually the data integration that we were doing. So, and by that I mean helping users acquire data from their databases and from platforms like Salesforce and Stripe and Marketo, and sort of the whole laundry list of SaaS tools, and getting it into a queryable place for them, which in our case was our own data warehouse, but in many cases was their data warehouse. And eventually that's kind of where Stitch came from, was that as a tool, the part of RJ Metrics that was resonating most was that data acquisition, data integration piece. And we decided to sort of separate out that piece from the product, and that's what became Stitch. And so I kind of got the benefit of going, sort of from the BI space into this more focused data integration space with Stitch. And of course, Stitch sort of rode the wave of cloud data warehouses, and that allowed us to focus very heavily on just moving data from various source platforms into cloud data warehouses, predominantly Redshift, BigQuery, Snowflake, and not really worrying too much about sort of the open-ended transformation side of the problem, and sort of leaving that to the downstream tools. And I think a lot of ways that kind of was part of, I wouldn't say we started the sort of modern data stack way of looking at the problem, but I think we were sort of involved in that moment in time, right? Where it sort of went from ETL to ELT, or at least ETLT, depending on who you talk to. And we were sort of very much part of that movement, and sort of, I think, helped a lot of people kind of move in that direction.
And as far as the Omni Analytics platform that you're building now, I'm wondering if you can give a bit of an overview about what it is and some of the story behind how it got started and why this particular area of focus is where you wanted to spend your time and energy now.
The origin story is myself and my two co-founders, first and foremost are friends, and kind of all worked on different parts of the data stack over the past 10 years or so. So like I said, I sort of went from business intelligence to data integration. My co-founders, Colin and Jamie, actually worked at Looker for most of the past 10 years in sort of various product leadership roles. And they were sort of very much in the BI side of the problem. through through a series of conversations over the years, we sort of all kind of rallied around this idea that, despite all the great advancements in cloud data warehouses, in tons of really awesome tools in this sort of modern data stack toolkit, data was still really hard to work with, right? And while maybe some users got some better tools in their toolkit to deal with it, there was still a lot of opportunity left on the table. And like I said earlier, that I think I personally had some desire to sort of go back to BI, which is kind of where I started with RJ Metrics, revisit the problem a little bit with sort of the benefit of more experience. And also, I think having been at Stitch for a while, we were sort of in the we're kind of the middleware behind the scenes data pipes, and I was personally really excited to sort of get back closer to the end user and the point of data consumption, just because it always felt like there was a lot of leverage to solve real problems there, right? Right. At Stitch, I always wanted to help people understand how fresh their data was because we knew that really well. But really want to open our tool to go do it, right? They wanted to sort of see that within the dashboard that they were building. So that experience made me really excited to kind of get back closer to the end user. And like I said, so more generally, we just felt like there was a lot of opportunity left on the table to make data easier to use. And I think specifically where we felt like there was a good opportunity was in the world of data modeling. And in addition to building Stitch and RJ Metrics, in the course of that experience, I was actually able to both sort of create and participate in a couple of open source projects. One was Singer, which was sort of like the data integration framework that Stitch used to power its integrations. And the other was DBT. So I sort of worked with the founders of DBT Labs. They were all employees at RJ Metrics, and I was actually part of the team that sort of built the first version of DBT and have since been an avid user of DBT. And so I sort of, through that experience, was trained to sort of think about data modeling, right? And of course, my co-founders at Looker, very much the same thing, right? Different tool used to do the data modeling with Looker, but fundamentally kind of getting at the same problem, which is that data modeling gives you a lot of leverage, right? It gives you the leverage to ensure your data is accurate. It gives you the leverage to curate data that maybe a less technical user could then go and use, and also sort of security and control concerns. And so what we observed and sort of what we're trying to do with Omni is sort of play into that data modeling and help more people do it, but also recognizing that some of the patterns that we've developed and the processes that have developed around data modeling today are full of friction and are pretty inefficient. And so, what we see is that whether you're using Looker or DBT or any other sort of approach to data modeling, it ends up being you sort of have the data modelers over here on one team and the sort of analysts and users of the data on another team or elsewhere in the organization. And the handoff between the two can be slow, can be inefficient, can be full of waiting. And we feel that is not always obviously very inefficient on its face. And sometimes that efficiency is worth it if you're trying to build a deck for your executive team to review and you really want to make sure you get it right. But sometimes that's not really an appropriate trade-off to make when you just want to answer a question quickly. You can get started immediately and start answering that question by writing SQL or sort of looking at the data yourself. And so the thing, and we sort of observed this with our own experience. We saw a lot of people actually using two separate tools for each of those sort of modes of analytics, using like a Looker or a Tableau for sort of like the governed metrics and the governed data, and then using a different tool or maybe even just like a SQL querying interface like Snowflake or BigQuery's built-in interface for doing sort of more of the ad hoc exploration. But we think that sort of two tool approach leaves a lot on the table because actually we think of it as sort of more of a progression, right? Where you sort of start ad hoc and then that sort of gradually evolves into something that is more important and the data model sort of comes out of. And so that was the key sort of insight that led us to starting Omni. And that's sort of like the sort of key differentiator we think of with Omni is that we want to be able to sort of sit in the middle and be both a sort of ad hoc querying tool and a modeled governed BI tool, and have fast, efficient, evolutionary paths to go from one end of the spectrum to the other.
And an interesting aspect of this problem area is one, business intelligence as a product category is very long in story. It has gone through a lot of generational shifts, but also there is a lot of debate and conversation happening right now about this modeling and kind of semantics layer of the analytics and business intelligence experience, and whether that actually belongs in the business intelligence tool or as a dedicated layer or in the data warehouse. And everybody has a slightly different take on how they want to see that manifest. And I'm wondering what your perspective is on that conversation and some of the ways that you're thinking about being able to take some of the automated modeling that you're building in Omni and not have that be locked into Omni exclusively, where that has been a big pain point for business intelligence systems to date, where there is a lot of this domain and semantic modeling happening in business intelligence, but then it has to be rebuilt somewhere else because you also need those same models in, your machine learning system.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say we have sort of like a big tent view of this particular topic, and the sort of more nuanced explanation there is that we sort of view it as, whether you're talking about sort of using DBT to materialize your models in the warehouse, or using a semantic layer to sit on top of those models and expose them in a different way, or using modeling system built into the BI tool. We think all of those approaches, a combination of them, is appropriate depending on the use case. And we actually just want to provide sort of seamless paths between them, right? And so, the way that Omni works is that you can sort of start querying immediately and from your queries. And this is sort of one of the beautiful things about SQL as an abstraction, is that like there's really no distinction between a query and a model, right? It's just a query. And so what you can do in Omni is sort of promote a query that you have written to be part of sort of your shared data model that can be reused by yourself and other people within your organization. But actually, you can go a step further than that too, and you can promote it from Omni into your DBT repository, right? And so we sort of view it as, we think DBT is great, but we also think that if to answer a quick ad hoc question, having to go build a DBT model before you can answer the question is an inefficient workflow. And so our view of the world is, as those models become more critical and mature, and there's certainly also like optimization considerations here, right? If you want to materialize the data into the table for the sake of speed and efficiency, then DBT is a great tool to use for that. And we're going to try to provide you sort of a good workflow and user experience to promote from the BI tool into that DBT layer, if that's what you're using. And then I think the other side of this is long term, and this is not something we have today, but longer term, we would also we want to build our platform in a very sort of open way, because we do think the ecosystem of data tools today is great, and we want to allow people to leverage those tools. So we want to build in such a way that you're certainly not going to be locked into just using your Omni data model with Omni charts and dashboards, because there's just so many other great tools out there, right? Some people may need a notebooking experience, right? Other people might just want to use their favorite query runner and integrate with the model. And so we're still kind of road mapping out exactly what form this will take, but over time we do expect to sort of expose APIs, potentially things like JDBC and ODBC drivers that would allow you to sort of query on top of your model in other tools, but still sort of leverage the model knowledge that Omni has.
And given your team's background in this BI space, what are some of the technical and organizational anti-patterns that you see growing up around the development and usage of BI systems, and some of the ways that you're looking to counteract that with this automated modeling capability in Omni?
Yeah, so there's a few, and I alluded to some a minute ago, in the sense of like, we think that the idea of having to sort of go wait on somebody to build you a data model to do like a quick ad hoc exploration is a fairly broken process and workflow. And so I think the most extreme version of that is I need this additional dimension added to my to my report, and having to wait in a queue for a week to do that, right? Which probably is not a very difficult task. And so I think that's one of the sort of key pieces that we think is broken and that we want to improve. I think another sort of related one is just I think data models, sort of data models bring their own sort of maintenance burden, right? And you have a data model, I'm sure that the sort of the week you built it, it's clean and everything is accurate and not out of date. But from experience, we've seen that over time, you've built a piece of the model, and maybe that ends up sort of being superseded by a different model somewhere else, but you sort of forget that the old one exists, and you end up just building up a lot of cruft in your data model. And so, in addition to automating and you're sort of helping you build the model, we also want to help you maintain it, right? And whether that's pointing out duplicative logic, pointing out unused logic, pointing out logic that maybe we've recognized has some looks erroneous or looks like it's changed dramatically. I think that's the sort of thing that particularly sort of over time, we hope that we can kind of build not just the helpers for creating new, but also sort of curating and maintaining that model as well.
Another aspect of business intelligence that makes it so complex to deal with is that it is kind of the confluence point in an organization of multiple different types of stakeholders and contributors and consumers of data. And I'm wondering what you see, what are the key elements of that kind of juncture that make business intelligence such a difficult product to employ effectively?
Yeah. And I think a key part of our vision is to meet the users of data where they are. And, we don't just mean that for the person who purchases Omni, we mean it for every person in their organization. And the piece that, like I mentioned earlier, we sort of recognize that, particularly as more use cases like data science come into play, charts and dashboards are sort of not sufficient to sort of solve the entire data problem, right? And so the way we sort of envision this, and we've sort of started with a couple of primitives within Omni, and those primitives being charts and dashboards, and what we have we have topics that we introduced recently, which is sort of like a more flexible way to explore data without being completely locked into a dashboard or a chart. And I think that's sort of the beginning of a longer vision in terms of providing experiences and even just like sub products within Omni and integrations with other products outside of Omni that are targeting certain types of users and use cases. And I think that to me is a big part of how I think the best part about BI is that I think it's purchased with a lot of sort of aspirational intent to be sort of like the system of truth and the place where we will answer all of our data questions. But as you sort of alluded to, I think reality tends to not quite reach that aspiration. And we think that one of the keys to actually getting there is to recognize that, charts and dashboards are not enough. They're usually good for a lot of things, but they're not interactive. They are not solving every type of data problem that exists out there. And, you have one of my favorite examples, like the finance team, right? Like the finance team is going to live in Excel, no matter what kind of tool you decide to introduce beside them. Like they're going to live in Excel. And one of the things that makes me cringe is the sort of, passing back Excel sheets between, drives and emails, and then, not even having any reconciliation between that Excel sheet and what's going on in the data warehouse and sort of the BI side of the world. And so, one of our goals is to, using the data model as sort of like the foundation, be able to sort of provide, whether it's the integrations or the sort of first party experiences within Omni, to provide like the different kinds of tools and user experiences that those different types of users need, but all backed by a shared model that will give them some confidence that the data that they're looking at in this department is the same that the ones that in the other department are using as well. So I think that's part of the vision, but I completely agree that up to this point that is not a particularly well solved problem.
Another complaint that I've seen levied against BI systems frequently is that, to your point of charts and dashboards, it's all well and good to be able to see, okay, this is what this chart is showing, but what does that actually mean? Or what is some concrete action that I can take as a result of this? And then having to actually say, okay, well, here's an answer that I'm getting here. Now I have to go into some other system, remember what I've learned from the BI platform, and then take some sort of action from that. And, that's where you've seen things like reverse ETL be some form of answer to that, or There's some business intelligence systems where their focus is on being able to say, okay, well, based on this, we think you should take this action. Here's a button to do that. Or being able to, have that be a place where you can ask questions of other people. And I'm wondering if you can just talk to the overall scope of Omni and what it is that you're specifically trying to achieve in terms of, is it just analytics or predictive analytics or prescriptive analytics or actionable analytics or whatever kind of moniker you want to put on it?
Yeah, and I mean, I think not to downplay the question, but I do think a lot of that is marketing around it, but again, the aspiration is real and good and makes sense. That showing the data is one thing, but actually until you act on it, you haven't really created a whole lot of value. And the way I think about this is I think sort of like the baby step towards it is like just being able to embed the analytics and the visual charting and graphing where into the place where it is most likely to be used and with the context. So, right, if you're trying to help a customer success person understand how their customer is using the product, if they live in Salesforce, embed those charts into Salesforce, right? Don't require them to sort of flip back and forth. So I think that's kind of like step one. And then, to your point, I think there's sort of the entire broad category of data science often boils down to how can you sort of separate this fairly abstract signal into maybe categorization of an action that might need to take place or something like that. And I think the way we view that is, like I mentioned earlier, through whether it's first party features that we eventually build, or more likely in the near term integrations with other tools in the ecosystem. We want our platform to be open to integrate with those tools. And certainly over time, I would expect that our functionality will include those sorts of things. But at the end of the day, when I think about that sort of my initial vision about just making data easier to work with, I actually feel like there's a lot of sort of simple stuff that needs to be easier and better that needs to be solved before we try to tackle some of the more advanced automated inference types of problems. So absolutely part of the vision, but we think that step one is to actually get sort of the groundwork laid and make the basic things easier, and eventually over time we'll get to that point where some of these more advanced computer assisted action suggesting and taking takes place as well.
So in terms of the actual platform that you're building, can you describe a bit about the implementation details and some of the ways that you're thinking about the technical and user experience design around it?
Sure. Yeah. And so there's a couple sort of key tenets of how we're building the product that I think are pretty interesting. The first one is, of course, like I said, the data model is a sort of core piece of the product, very much the foundation of the product. And the way our data model works is kind of interesting in that we actually think of it as sort of a layered data model. And so the bottom layer of our data model is actually in the database. It's the schema of the database that we're operating on top of. And then the layer on top of that is what we call our shared model. And that's where sort of the curated data model that might have fact tables and might have renamed fields or any number of customizations that is sort of consistent across the organization lives. And so that's sort of your starting point for whenever you're doing analysis in Omni. And that's sort of when I think of the model, that's actually the model that I think of. And it's sort of it's a layer on top of that the database model. And then further, we actually have so the system is actually built in such a way that the model can sort of be layered and composed sort of almost infinitely. But in practice, the next layer is what we call a workbook model. And so when you go to actually start doing work in Omni, you actually create a new workbook model, which ends up becoming your sandbox for that workbook. And you can start modifying and overriding things in the model layers beneath you. But that is just going to live in your workbook model until you decide to either promote it into one of those, into that shared model, or depending on sort of the permission model applied to your organization, maybe you sort of open up essentially a pull request to ask to promote it into that shared model. And so I think this is kind of one of the unique things that we've done is we've sort of allowed you to sandbox and kind of start from the model and then in isolation start to modify that model and curate it to yourself, or potentially just add to it, right? And start adding tables. And so, this is sort of an example of like in that sort of ad hoc, I just want to answer a question use case. You might not really be modifying the model much at all, or you might be sort of creating some new calculations that maybe at the end of your ad hoc exploration you decide are useless, right? You've come to no conclusions. You're not interested in this problem anymore. And if you do that, then okay, those are just in your workbook model and will really not affect the rest of the system at all until that workbook is viewed again. And so I think that's one of the key parts of the system that is giving us a lot of leverage to think of this modeling exercise as evolutionary, because we're sort of thinking of it as a layer cake that can then be sort of promoted between layers when it is appropriate. Another piece that is very sort of core to what we're doing, I mentioned earlier, is integrating with the ecosystem. And so, this is sort of our first version of this is our integration with DBT, which is not only can we integrate with your DBT repository to get more sort of metadata and lineage information about your data, but we can also promote to your DBT repository so that you can, for things where it's appropriate to sort of materialize them and manage them with DBT, you can do that seamlessly. So I think that idea of the product, like a first class feature of the product, is integration with the ecosystem like DBT.
And as you have been building this platform and exploring the problem space, I'm wondering what are some of the ways that the goals and vision of the product and the actual implementation details have changed or evolved?
One thing that we're doing in Omni that's actually pretty cool is we're not only generating SQL based on sort of your interactions with our user interface, we're actually parsing SQL as well. And so you can actually open up Omni, open up the SQL query pane, and start typing SQL. And any SQL that's valid to run against your warehouse, we will run. We'll also attempt to parse that SQL. And our goal is to try to make it so that whether you want to write SQL or you just want to sort of like interact with our UI, the experience is equivalent. What we found is that the parsing piece is it can be sort of jarring to kind of go back and forth between those two. So like abstractly, we like that idea, but from like a user experience perspective, what we found is that you end up sort of confusing yourself if you actually do sort of write some SQL and then interact with our UI and then go back to writing SQL. And so we're still trying to kind of nail that user experience. And I think I think the original vision was to sort of make those things equivalent and sort of allow you to bounce back and forth seamlessly. I think increasingly it feels like the SQL parsing is maybe just going to turn into more of like suggestions of sort of model pieces that you might be interested in and that you can sort of keep in the model rather than sort of a full one-to-one equivalence. But that's one example where we're sort of trying to feel out exactly what the user wants. And I think similarly, we're all like fairly technical, either in the engineering sense or the analytics sense. A lot of our organization has done one of those jobs or both for a long time. And I think the thing that I've noticed is that we tend to sort of build the power version of the tool and then take a step back and say, all right, so how do we reduce and simplify this so that it is actually understandable to anyone, and or at least the part of the audience that we think is most relevant, right? And I think that's sort of been that I think that has ended up being our process, is that we sort of build in a lot of functionality and a lot of capability, and then we sort of need to take a refinement pass over our user experience and say, all right, how do we actually make this understandable for somebody who didn't build it? And I think that's actually been a good process, because it's like you sort of have this very creation oriented mindset in the first phase, and then you sort of switch this sort of like refinement and reduction mindset to try to like really nail it in the second phase.
And digging into the workflow for a team using Omni, I'm wondering if you can talk through that. And in particular, I'm curious about some of the ways that you address the tendency for multiple very close but slightly disparate models to grow up, and some of the challenges of kind of the master data management question that comes up when you are trying to build these semantic models in a BI context.
Yeah. So in terms of the first part of the question, the ideal workflow is roughly what I described earlier in the sense of like we think the best way to start is to just start answering questions and querying. And I think explicitly, if somebody wants to start by building their data model, then sure, great, more power to them. And you can not only do that interactively within the tool, but you can also do it programmatically using our sort of syntax and IDE that you can save in version control and so forth. So if you kind of if you're migrating from another data model or something like that, that's fine. But I think for anybody who's sort of starting from scratch, our view is just start answering questions, just start querying, and that will sort of dictate what your data model is. And you can then, as you start answering related questions, it will become clear which parts of that data model are in fact reusable, and you can promote those into the shared model and sort of continue from there. And so that is kind of the abstract way we like to think of people using the product, is to sort of just start by answering questions and then kind of come back and refine your model after you've answered the question or as you're answering it. And what was the second part of the question? Sorry.
Thinking about how to manage some of the tendency for there to be a sprawl of slightly different perspectives on what a semantic model is supposed to represent.
Yes, right. So, I mean, exactly. Great point. And right. We think that model maintenance problem is just as much of the problem as the model creation problem. And right now, the way we view that is that we're showing essentially like a unified. Well, so there's a couple ways, right? There are sort of permissioning systems that you can apply in Omni that would allow you to say like, okay, only these people can modify the shared model. So anyone else, and perhaps even including these people, should be going through sort of like a pull request or merge request or sort of change management type of process to change that model. And so that'll enable sort of a human to kind of do that curation and deduplication and maintenance as it happens. But I think that's not sufficient. And the other way we're solving this problem is by sort of showing a history of the model. And I think increasingly the plan is to sort of apply some intelligence on top of that history to flag things that may be worthy of further investigation. Like, hey, this logic is the same as this logic, and this part of a model has not been used for this many months. Should you consider removing it? That sort of thing. So we kind of view that second, like the maintenance problem, as one that's sort of a combination of like giving users a good view into the changes that are happening, and then also algorithmically helping them identify where there's sort of lurking demons in terms of maintenance.
The other interesting aspect of building a BI platform, especially today, given the number of options that are out there, is how the evolution of the surrounding ecosystem has influenced the realm of the possible, and what are the kind of shifts in the surrounding technical capabilities that led to your decision that now is the right time to embark on this new vision of what BI should be.
Yeah. I mean, it's almost not new anymore, but I think we shouldn't underestimate the impact that the cloud data warehouses have had. The reality is 10 years ago, the idea of having a data warehouse was limited to, the top very small percentage of companies who could afford Teradata racks. And now it is accessible to, any company and at a very affordable starting price. And so I think that, and combined with that are the tools like Stitch and of course like Fivetran and some of the other data integration tools out there that are helping you actually get the data into the warehouse quickly and easily and affordably. And so I think that those have been a huge enabler. And I think a lot of the most recent sort of full BI tools have certainly adapted to take advantage of that, but not too many of them were actually architected from the ground up to work exclusively on cloud data warehouses. So I think that's we shouldn't discount how big that wave is and how important it is, even if it feels like it was ages ago. The other piece that I think is very relevant to us, and something that we're trying to do is in addition to making it fast to model, we just think that the speed of querying is an enormous enabler of being able to analyze and understand data quickly. And so everything we are building has sort of speed and performance as top priority. And one of the things that we're doing is, it feels like it's a very popular thing to do right now, is we're using Apache Arrow as sort of our data on the wire and actually on disk format, to reduce sort of the cost of serialization and deserialization everywhere. And we're also we're caching data in both our server tier and the browser in such a way that it can be requeried using DuckDB, so that as much as possible, we can actually answer questions without having to go back to the server, right? Whether that's our server or the database server. And so, the goals there being both really fast and hopefully save you a few bucks on, that cloud data warehouse bill if it's usage based. So those, I would say that, our ability to do that has been greatly accelerated by technologies like Arrow and DuckDB.
And in terms of the ways that you're thinking about approaching the problem and the product that you're building, what are some of the positive and negative sources of inspiration that you've looked to?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, our own experience is probably the biggest influence in terms of inspiration. And like I said, I think the experience of having both built and used sort of modeling centric products like DBT and Looker has sort of informed a fairly nuanced view about the role of modeling. And while it has not turned us away from modeling, it sort of made us recognize that modeling is a good thing, but it is a tool to be wielded sort of thoughtfully and carefully, and not sort of used as a answer to every single problem and every single sort of use case and workflow. So I think that's been a huge influence on how we've thought about the problem. I'm trying to think of other things that come to mind there. I would say another one is, even though we're trying to sort of evolve the way people think about this sort of data modeling workflow, and to maybe make them think outside of that box of like, hey, I need to go code up my DBT model or code up my LookML model. We do also really firmly believe in the idea that having a code representation of the model and sort of the software engineering workflow around it is a power tool. It's a power tool for the power user, but it is a necessary component. So, we're not trying to, in terms of sort of positive influences, like we do very much view that as a key piece of the solution here. It's just that, we're also trying to sort of build a more interactive experience beside it, so that other users can use that sort of less software engineering style of workflow when it's appropriate.
And in your experience of building Omni and working with some of your customers on applying it to their specific problems, what are some of the most interesting or innovative or unexpected ways that you've seen it used?
Yeah, a cool use case that has come up, that it's actually one that I've sort of always been intrigued to try, and we're actually seeing it with Omni, is actually sort of using a sort of data warehouse, data viz BI approach to analyzing sort of operational server logs. And I personally have cringed at like my Elasticsearch bill from running, ingesting all my logs into Elasticsearch and similar other platforms in the past. And at the same time, always like never felt like I understood those querying languages quite as well as I knew SQL. And so I think particularly with platforms like BigQuery and Snowflake, where you can sort of keep data sort of in cold storage for very cheap, this use case has always intrigued me. And so we're actually seeing some use of this idea where the data, so the server logs are being formatted into Snowflake and then being queried using Omni. And actually, Omni is great for this use case because we have a lot of helper functionality for like breaking apart JSON and exploring it, where sometimes that syntax gets a little gnarly and difficult in raw SQL, but we've got a lot of like the interactive querying in Omni makes it fairly simple. And so I feel like that is a really cool use case that I would love to see more people use. I do think it probably ends up being cheaper. I think it's a little too early to tell, but I think it probably ends up being cheaper than running sort of massive Elasticsearch clusters, or paying for some of the third-party tools that can get quite expensive as well.
And in your experience of building the platform and the product, what are some of the most interesting or unexpected or challenging lessons that you've learned in the process?
I think, for me personally, having sort of worked in the BI space for a while and then gotten away from it, and spent more sort of in the data pipe space for the past, say, 5 or so years, I had sort of lost sight of how big and complex the visualization feature and problem itself is, right? Like, of course, data viz is a feature of BI, and by no means the only feature of BI, although it's a very important one. But even within visualization, there is such a rich set of research about how to visualize data, and both commercial and open source libraries that sort of help with taking structured data and mapping it into a visualization. And then you sort of have, as a BI tool, you have to solve the problem of like, not only how do I sort of present the user with a way to kind of like format the visualization based on their data, but can I actually do some of that for them, and at least give them a good guess as to what they probably want to see when they open up their chart visual on top of this data set. And so I think I was quickly reminded, after having been away from it for a while, how deep that topic is. And we, as a BI tool, we know we want to be great at visualization, and we expect to invest heavily in it. And shameless plug, this is why we're hiring for visualization engineers right now. And it's a topic that is, I think, both very deep and very difficult, because also there's just a lot of the problem itself is sort of intertwined, right? Like if you want to sort of add a grouping to an existing visual, it might impact some of the other existing encoding in the visual. So how do you do that in such a way that the user isn't surprised by what they see? And I think that's a fairly complex topic that I've come to appreciate how much academic research goes into. And it's something that we are already investing heavily in and expect to invest even more heavily in over time.
And for people who are evaluating which business intelligence system to use, or whether they are already using a business intelligence system, whether it makes sense to add Omni to the stack, what are the cases where Omni Analytics is the wrong choice?
Yeah, I mean, I think Omni operates on top of a warehouse, right? So if you are, if your team does not have the capability to operate a warehouse or get data into a warehouse, then Omni definitely wouldn't be a good choice. The good news is I think both of those problems have become easier over time with very sort of low management and maintenance platforms like Snowflake and BigQuery in particular, and tools like Stitch and Fivetran for getting data into the warehouse. I think additionally, right, if you don't have anyone who's sort of data, when you start with Omni, you actually have to sort of build the model and the queries yourself, right? And over time, I imagine we'll have some templating and so forth, but you still have to sort of play a very active role in deciding what to query and actually building that query, maybe not with SQL, but at least with, sort of our interactive query builder. And, if a company doesn't have that skill set and, maybe is just looking for some more like pre-made analysis, then I don't know that Omni would be the best choice in favor of some, there's a lot of great platforms out there that are, focused on answering questions about customer success or about, product funnels, or any variety. I'm sure there's products out there for just about every question you could imagine. And I think, in some cases, those would be more appropriate than Omni.
And as you continue to build and iterate on the Omni platform, what are some of the things you have planned for the near to medium term, or any particular problem areas or projects that you're excited to dig into?
Yeah. Oh, great question. So yeah, the roadmap is long, and I'm trying to think of some highlights to call out here. So I mentioned the DBT integration. Right now, we have an integration to help you generate DBT models, and the roadmap for that feature which I expect will be achieved in the coming months here, is to both help you sort of not only generate the model, but automatically sync it with your DBT repository, and also then sort of read the metadata from the DBT repository to inform Omni about lineage and other sort of metadata that we can glean from it. So that's one that I'm pretty excited about. Others, we are planning to invest heavily in the what we call our own IDE experience, which is the part of our app that allows you to programmatically define the data model. And so right now we have sort of a basic text editor, but we are the near-term roadmap going to be sort of building auto completion and suggestions and validation into that editor, and also integrating with Git so that the code representation of the data model can be version controlled and sort of managed in that way. And I imagine also, hopefully we will be able to build some integrations with third-party editors like VS Code for folks who want to work in, sort of outside of a web browser. So I think that entire sort of universe of functionality around programmatically defining and managing the data model is a big area of focus for the coming months. And I think in addition to that too, we have dashboards that you can sort of build interactively, but we also want to treat dashboards as sort of a code artifact that you can manage as code. I think particularly for use cases like embedded analytics is what we call it, which is application developers using Omni to expose data analytics in their own apps. All that the sort of software workflows and software engineering workflows become really important for those use cases. And actually, the last feature to mention is that embedded analytics use case where we are going to be working on both a permissioning model and sort of a embedding model to allow people to embed charts and dashboards into their own apps, and also apply things like row level filtering and so forth based on user attributes to only show the appropriate things when that embedding happens.
Are there any other aspects of what you're building at Omni or this overall problem of model generation and maintenance that we didn't discuss yet that you'd like to cover before we close out the show?
I think we covered a lot of it. The questions were great, and I think that you hit the creation points, the maintenance points, the sort of assisting users. So I think we hit a lot of it. Thank you.
All right. Well, for anybody who wants to get in touch with you and follow along with the work that you're doing, I'll have you add your preferred contact information to the show notes. And as the final question, I'd like to get your perspective on what you see as being the biggest gap in the tooling or technology that's available for data management today. Good
question. So I go back sort of to that abstract idea that like data is still too hard to work with. And I think what that means for me is I think the way I would characterize the gap is we kind of have the pre-canned report on the sort of one end of the spectrum, and then we have sort of like full-blown querying on the other end of the spectrum. And I think we've been thoughtful enough about sort of all the different sort of types of users and use cases and experience that sort of fill in between those two ends. And I think that's where, when I talk about data still being too hard to work with, I don't think it's some kind of like magical assistive AI that's going to make it easier to work with. I think it's going back to that phrase, meeting the users where they are. Like, I think it's really being thoughtful about different use cases and being able to deliver sort of high quality, quote unquote, good data to that type of experience that is appropriate for the user, whether it's a chart or a dashboard sort of on the reporting end of the spectrum, or a spreadsheet or a notebook, or maybe sort of a data application, or sort of a custom built app in sort of some other cases. So I think that's where I see lots of opportunity, because I think data management is only as good as it helps users actually use data, use it correctly, and get insights and actionable insights out of it. And I think that's where we're falling down, is that for most people, the types of data experiences we're trying to give them aren't really that useful.
All right. Well, thank you very much for taking the time today to join me and share the work that you and your team are doing at Omni Analytics. It's definitely a very interesting product, and it's great to see this challenge of modeling built into some of the core workflows of these BI systems. So I appreciate all of the time and energy that you folks are putting into that, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, Tobias. You too. Bye.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to check out our other shows, Podcast.init, which covers the Python language, its community, and the innovative ways it is being used, and the Machine Learning Podcast, which helps you go from idea to production with machine learning. Visit the site at dataengineeringpodcast.com to subscribe to the show, sign up for the mailing list, and read the show notes. And if you've learned something or tried out a project from the show, then tell us about it. Email hosts at dataengineeringpodcast.com with your story. And to help other people find the show, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts and tell your friends and coworkers.